Hello and welcome to my 5th video in this series on the first 6 Saw films. As with the previous videos in this series, the first 3 sections of this video will contain spoilers up to and including the one that we're talking about today, which is obviously Saw 5, while the last 2 sections will also contain spoilers for Saw 6. So while all of these sections are time-coded in the description for you to skip around as much as you'd like, I do ask that you avoid those last 2 sections unless you have in fact seen Saw 6 as well. But okay, let's get into Saw 5. So I like the idea of this trap quite a bit. There are some potential issues that it raises with continuity that I will get into a little bit later. But when first viewing this movie, I obviously wasn't aware of the context of this trap, as far as where it was taking place in the timeline, as well as who exactly was behind it. And so therefore, without that context and just taking the trap at face value, I thought it was a cool idea for a trap. And I really like that last shot of this scene quite a bit. I really like this trap a lot, particularly for its simplicity. So they go out of their way to show us that everything has been taken out of Strom's pocket. So the fact that he still has his pin on him tells us that this was done intentionally and that this is exactly what whoever put him into this trap wanted him to do. They wanted him to survive. So I didn't point this out in my Saw 4 video, but you actually can see throughout that movie that Jill is wearing this key around her neck, and she's kind of playing with it during her interrogation.
Today we honor the newly promoted Detective Lieutenant, Mark Hoffman.
And here we see the character Pamela Jenkins, the reporter. She becomes one of the main characters in the next film. So the fact that they introduced her in this one without actually having her be important to this film is just another thing that shows us how much this series had started embracing the episodic nature of this story.
Over a dozen dead bodies were recovered at the scene, 2 of which were cops.
This line always kind of tripped me up because Erickson clearly says that there was over a dozen bodies at that crime scene. And yet, by my count, there were only 10. In the operating room, you had 4 bodies, John, Amanda, Jeff, and Lynn. Then in the scale room, you had Eric Matthews, Rigg, and Art Blank. And then you had the 3 victims of Jeff's tests, which brings it to 10. So why does he say there were over a dozen bodies found? I think the explanation is that he misspeaks slightly. He says that over a dozen bodies were recovered at the scene, but I think what he means is that over a dozen bodies were discovered that night. Because if you take the 10 at the Gideon meatpacking plant and then add the ones that died elsewhere through like Rigg's game, you have 3 more bodies, which obviously adds up to 13, which is over a dozen.
Jigsaw's dead. How many lives did I inevitably save?
So right here, Strom is claiming credit for Jigsaw's death. He asks Erickson, how many lives did I inevitably save? But he didn't actually do anything. Well, he did do something. He killed Jeff. So it's kind of funny that he's claiming credit for this. What's also funny is that this scene comes almost directly after the scene where Hoffman kind of does the exact same thing. When he's telling Strom to back off, Hoffman is saying that he's been chasing Jigsaw since the beginning and that he got him. Yet, similar to Strom, he doesn't appear to have done anything to catch Jigsaw. That said, in Hoffman's case, I actually think there's a little bit more to this, but I'm going to save that for a later section of this video. A neat little thing here that I actually only noticed fairly recently is that the 5 people in this trap, they wake up in the order that they die in. This probably isn't even that worth mentioning, but I've always thought it was kind of weird that Hoffman's sister doesn't have his last name. So the way the door hits Strom here cracks me up every time I see it.
Made it look like a jigsaw trap. I got you.
So I'm trying to save my criticisms of this movie for the review and analysis section. But believe me, I have things to say about Strom's behavior in this movie. So when I first saw this film, I didn't really think that Jigsaw was telling them to work together to survive each of the rooms. I didn't know that. But the part that I did immediately think was very obvious was that those chambers were big enough for more than one person. So again, I didn't necessarily think that Jigsaw was intending for them to fit more than one person in there. But as I was watching it, I was like, I don't know why you guys are fighting over this. Two of you can share a tunnel. Of course, once you do know that that is what Jigsaw wanted, and then you imagine the scenario in which all 5 players made it through the first room and into this second room, then the question that the tape asks takes on a cool new meaning. Because there would have been 3 chambers available for 5 people, that means you'd have 2 pairs sharing tunnels and then 1 extra person in their own tunnel. So they would have been the odd man out.
Going up?
Yes, thank you.
What floor are you going to?
I think we're both going to the same place.
There are a few things I enjoy about this scene, only one of which do I feel confident I enjoyed in the way the filmmakers wanted me to enjoy it. And that one is John's line about, I think we're both going to the same place. I think it's a good line. But the other 2 are ones that I just find kind of goofy. Like John wearing glasses. That's just not a good disguise. And the last one is that I like to imagine that John was just riding that elevator up and down for, half an hour before Hoffman finally showed up.
And by the way, the blade on your pendulum was inferior.
Okay, so this is something that I'm having a hard time waiting for the review and analysis to address. And that is how ridiculous John's criticism of Hoffman's pendulum is. Like I said at the beginning, I like that trap. But once it's revealed that Hoffman's the one that built the entire thing, including the hand presses, and that it happened so early in Jigsaw's career, back when he was still doing pretty simple games like Knives to the Face or Razor Wire Maze, or use a candle while you've got flammable gel smeared all over you. Taking all of that into account, it would have been borderline ridiculous for this to have been John's trap this early on, although at least we know he has the engineering expertise to do so. Whereas Hoffman doing it, It just seems kind of ridiculous. But then here, John insinuates that Hoffman did a very crappy job. And that's where I'm like, are you kidding me? It's far more impressive than anything you've done at this point.
Fuck you. Fuck you.
You see, it's a different method that I'm talking about.
So in case this wasn't clear to some people, what John's doing here by pulling the trigger and faking Hoffman out, he's showing Hoffman that relief that comes with surviving what you believed was going to kill you, and how that deepens one's appreciation for life. So the first thing I want to point out here is that you can actually see that this house seems to be connected to some sort of industrial building. And once Strom goes inside and we see him roaming around inside it, the layout should look pretty familiar to you. Especially once he goes down through that trapdoor and is in what are clearly the very same tunnels that the nerve gas house was above. I have a lot more to say on this whole topic, but I'm going to save it for the fourth section, as I kind of want to go into a little bit of what we find out in Saw 6. So in my video on Saw 4, I pointed out that Jeff was set up in a way that should he fail his test, which he obviously does, he was going to be in a situation that was almost certainly going to result in his death, which we see that play out. Strom, who is an FBI agent there looking for Jigsaw, he's the only one with the key to that room, and he's obviously going to go in there, with his gun raised. And Jeff is now, on the edge about his daughter and, is trying to find out where she is by raising the unloaded gun. Anyways, how that relates to Saw 5 is, I think, a very similar situation was the plan here at the end of the Fatal Fives trap. In the first 3 rooms, they obviously fail to work together and instead have gotten other people killed. Obviously, Britt and Malik figure this out in the last room, and they decide to work together instead of fighting to the death and, one of them dying and giving all the blood. But if they hadn't worked together and one of them had killed the other one and then simply walked out of that room, it seems very likely they would have been killed by Erickson the way Jeff was killed by Strom. If you look at how close Erickson came to killing Britt once she had emerged from the room, and when you consider that the only reason he didn't actually shoot her in that moment is because she was in a weakened state on the ground, it seems pretty feasible that somebody walking out of that last room where, he could maybe see the dead body, covered in another person's blood, maybe armed. It's easy to imagine how that would end with that last person dead as well, because they failed their test to work together. And even if that didn't happen, I would imagine they would go to prison and their life as they know it would be over anyways.
Will you heed my warning? For if you do not,
Fuck you.
this room will forever be your tomb, and my legacy will become yours.
Alright, so let's talk about the twists of this film. I think it's fair to say that the two big ones are that the Fatal Five were supposed to work together, and Hoffman was actually setting up Strom to be framed as the current Jigsaw. I did not find either of those twists to be shocking in the least, and this was the only entry in the first 6 films where I felt that, I wasn't in any way surprised by the twist. I certainly won't pretend that I knew right away that they all could have used the same key to get out of the neck collars, nor did I personally think about the fact that they could have shared the electrical shock with the bathtub. That said, I did notice the tunnels thing, as I mentioned previously, and even though I didn't, obviously know that the keys were all the same in the first room, I did think that if they just sent one person up and to get all the keys and then come back, they all could have made it out alive easy. So while I wasn't thinking the whole time that, they're not listening to Jigsaw, he's clearly telling them to work together, I wasn't thinking that, but I was thinking, you guys are being really stupid right now, you can all make it out of these rooms alive. And so for that reason, when it is revealed that they were supposed to work together, and they're like, oh my god, like we all could have made it out alive, I was just like, yeah, duh. As for the other one, I did kind of feel like that was obvious the whole time. It seemed pretty clear to me that Strom was starting to look suspicious and that Hoffman was making it look like he had something to do with things. So having that be treated as a big reveal was kind of a letdown for me. Even though I do actually like how it all came together, I just felt let down because in all 4 of the previous films, I was genuinely shocked about at least one thing that I didn't catch on to when I was watching it that first time. Unlike with Saw 4 and Saw 6, I don't really think there's anything that story-wise is dramatically different between the theatrical version and the director's cut of Saw 5. That said, I do think the overall quality of Saw 5 is improved with the director's cut. A lot of the more cringy dialogue is kind of cut out, specifically from the scene in which the lawyer gives Jill the box near the beginning, and the scene shortly after that where Hoffman is given the promotion and the award. Other than that, I know a lot of the scenes are in a different order in the 2 versions. For example, I believe, it's been a while since I saw the theatrical, but I believe the order of the hospital scenes is switched around in the versions. I believe in the theatrical version, Erickson visits Strom first, and then after that comes the scene where Hoffman visits Strom. So yeah, while I don't think there's anything that would necessarily be confusing if you watch the theatrical cut instead of the director's cut, I do feel like the director's cut is the superior version. Oh boy. So out of the first 6 films, I definitely think that this one is the weakest. Some of the acting and the dialogue, I think, are weaker here than anything we had seen in the series up to this point. I don't really have any criticisms in those regards about the people in the traps. I think all of that acting and the majority of that dialogue works for me. What doesn't, though, is what I ironically find to be the more interesting storyline of the movie, and that is Strom piecing together that Hoffman is, the accomplice. The way they have Strom driving all over town just to look at a room and then talk to himself is hilariously bad. There's not a single conclusion that he reaches by going to one of these places that he couldn't also have reached by simply looking at the files in the office. And what's almost as laughable as that is the fact that he has absolutely no evidence for the conclusions that he's reaching. We, the audience, know that he's right, but if someone in real life were to act this way, the odds of them being right about the conclusions that they're reaching are pretty slim. And then, yeah, having him talk to himself and even at one point turn towards the camera to do so, it's just not good. And as if that wasn't bad enough, they had to make it so that he, had a throat wound so that he's talking like this the whole time that he's doing it. It just makes this whole thing that is already very ridiculous even more ridiculous. To the point where I do genuinely find it funny, which I do often question if that was the intention. It at least seems like a possibility to me. As I mentioned in the first section, the twists were also underwhelming for me. And I do think that there is a third reveal of sorts that happens in this movie that actually deserved to be elaborated on more, as opposed to the two other ones, which were already fairly obvious and we didn't need, to see so explicitly. And the reveal I'm talking about is related to the arson and Hoffman's house. But once again, I'm going to get into that fully in the next section. But for the purposes of what I'm saying now, I like to point to what John tells Hoffman when he's handing him the file on the Fatal Five.
I need you to set up a game. It may not be entirely clear to you right now, but I assure you that the people being tested are part of something much larger. They're connected. So in the end, all the pieces will fit together. And it'll be clear.
He's basically promising the audience that in the end, all the pieces will fit together and it'll become clear. But ultimately, this promise isn't fulfilled. I mean, I guess it is if you consider, they just burnt down a property together and got some people killed. And that's what he was referring to. I guess if you consider that a satisfying resolution to what he was saying, then I guess they did fulfill that promise. But I actually think that there was more going on in relation to that arson as far as why John knew about it and why he was invested in it in any way. And that's what I think should have been more clear by the end of the movie. So all in all, out of the first 6 films, I definitely think that this is the weakest one. That said, over the years, I have developed a certain fondness for it. I'm certainly never bored watching it. Even the things about it that I think make it a bad movie, I find entertaining at least. And as just one episode in this ongoing narrative, I think that it fulfills its purpose well enough. And there are a handful of moments and scenes that I actually really like. But alright, let's get into the last 2 sections, which you should not watch yet if you have not seen Saw 6 at this point. If you have not seen that, please do stop this video here. But if you feel like coming back and finishing this video after you have seen that last one, please do so. Okay, before really diving into this, I did want to mention the poster for this movie that I used for the thumbnail. I meant to mention it up top, but it kind of works in this section as well. Though I do feel this is the weakest film of the original 6, it strangely enough has one of my favorite posters of the whole series, if not my favorite poster of the whole series. And that is obviously Hoffman wearing John's face as a mask. And it's communicating the idea that Hoffman wants to be Jigsaw. And I guess I'll use that as a jumping off point to get back to what Hoffman tells Strom about how he was hunting Jigsaw from the beginning and he got him. On the surface, this doesn't seem to make much sense since Hoffman was nowhere near John when he died. But once you've seen Saw 6 and you have a bit more information on the events leading up to John's death, I think this line that Hoffman says to Strom actually serves as a very clever clue as to that eventual reveal. In Saw 6, we see that Hoffman wrote the letter to Amanda to essentially blackmail her into killing Lynn Denlon. because Hoffman knows that if she does that, Jeff is then going to kill her, and then almost certainly John as well, and that will leave him on his own to do whatever he wants as the new Jigsaw. This film obviously shows us how Hoffman and John met, and how John basically forced Hoffman into helping him. But what it also sort of establishes, and then definitely gets more established in Saw 6, is that Hoffman clearly develops a taste for this work, though for very different reasons than John intended. As I mentioned in the Saw 3 video, John does the things that he does because he wants people to be rehabilitated. Meanwhile, Hoffman is interested in inflicting suffering and basically punishing people that he feels deserve to be punished. And so what I like about this movie and how it reveals that Hoffman was the first accomplice that John roped into this whole thing is that it shows us from more or less the beginning there were really two Jigsaws. John obviously executed Cecil's game all on his own. And then based on my interpretation of the timeline, I believe Hoffman's murder of Seth was the very next Jigsaw game. Now I'll go on a little tangent here to explain why I think that. So the FBI files have a list of probable Jigsaw victims, and people sometimes point to that list and say that Mark, the one from Saw 1 with the flammable gel smeared all over him, happened before Seth Baxter and also before Paul in the razor wire. In Saw 1, we are shown the razor wire trap first before we see Mark's. But given that that film and this series in general revels in the nonlinear storytelling, that doesn't necessarily mean that Mark's test came after Paul's. And so yeah, when people see that list of victims and it goes Cecil Fletcher and then Mark Wilson, I think was his last name, and then Seth Baxter, people tend to take that to mean that the Mark game happened before Hoffman was recruited and also before he killed Seth, obviously. Now, there are a couple of reasons that I would contradict that. The first being that if you look further down that list, you'll see that Jeff Rittenauer is listed after Lawrence Gordon, Adam Stanheidt, and Zeb Hindle. But we know that Jeff was the one in the drill chair 5 months before the bathroom game. This tells us that this list is not strictly in chronological order. But much more importantly than that, we know that Lawrence's pen light was actually discovered at Mark's trap.
There was someone standing outside here watching through this peephole. Looks like our friend Jigsaw likes to book himself front row seats to his own sick little games. He was there at the last one as well. Only this time, he left us his pen light.
So if John is giving it to Hoffman in Paul's game and telling him that they need to lead tap to Lawrence, this means Mark's game has to happen after Paul's game. And by the way, for everyone that has seen Saw 3D, I am aware that that movie tries to retroactively add an indefinite number of Jigsaw games that happened in between all of the ones we had already seen on screen, which is honestly one of the smallest reasons that I think that movie is really dumb. And yeah, obviously a big reason that I'm doing this whole series is because I want to release my rewrite of that movie. So for the purposes of this series and what I'm discussing right now, we're going to ignore the version of Saw 7 that exists. Especially given that in that scenario, the FBI just weirdly leaves out all these other victims. So finally coming back around to what I was saying about there being two Jigsaws from pretty much the beginning. In my mind, the first game was all John, and that was with Cecil. The second game was all Hoffman, and that was with Seth. And then from there, they were working together more or less. And so this sets up the idea that I find really interesting where, two Jigsaws, each with drastically different perspectives on what Jigsaw is and should be. Also, for the record, I am aware that part of the continuity issue that is raised with Hoffman setting up the Seth tape this early in the timeline is the fact that he used a Billy puppet, which prior to this point, the first time that ever showed up was in Amanda's game. And so if Hoffman was trying to make it look like the Jigsaw Killer killed Seth, how would he have known to make a Billy the Puppet tape? Regardless of whether or not, Mark's game took place before this or not, what is clear is that Amanda's game definitely took place well after Seth was killed. So this is absolutely something that should have been addressed in Saw 7. But that's obviously stepping on the toes of the final section. And before moving on to that, I do want to talk about the arson. So the reveal of how the 5 people in the main game of this movie are connected is that Britt started this conspiracy where an abandoned building would be burned down so that she could now build a new property there. And Malik was basically the patsy of this plan. The problem was then that apparently there were 8 people in this building, which was supposed to be abandoned, when Malik burnt it down. Now, at the same time that this is being revealed to us, that these people were connected through this conspiracy, we are seeing Strom make his way through Hoffman's house. And the layout is identical to the nerve gas house from Saw 2. And based on where the trapdoor takes Strom, and you see the blood streak on the floor, this tells us it is indeed the same house, or at least a rebuilt version of it. And then in Saw 6, at the beginning, when they talk about this real estate scam, Perez even calls it a house fire. And where that gets really interesting is that there were 5 bodies in the house: Laura, Jonas, Addison, Gus, and Avi. And then 3 bodies down in the bathroom. Obviously, the tunnels would not have been touched in this fire, as they appear to be completely undamaged. And therefore, for there to have been 8 bodies in the house when it was burned down, somebody would have had to have brought the 3 corpses from the bathroom up into the house. But frankly, taking all of these pieces together and, the fact that this is being revealed to us, this conspiracy was being revealed to us at the same time that we're seeing the remodeled nerve gas house, it strongly suggests to me that the property that Malik burned down was the nerve gas house. So I've already mentioned several things that I would have liked to see resolved in Saw 7. For example, why was the Billy puppet in Seth's tape if Jigsaw himself hadn't used Billy the puppet at this point in the timeline? And then what I had just mentioned at the end of the last section about the house fire and why that happened. But another thing that this movie sets up that I genuinely expected to have resolved was what exactly happened between John and Hoffman, between Paul's game and them setting up the house game. When they abduct Paul, we see that Hoffman is shedding tears, and he even then expresses remorse for what they're doing. But the very next flashback that we see of them working together is them preparing the nerve gas house, and there's this really revealing moment of Hoffman pointing the gun to each of the bodies on the floor. And then when he's handing John the gun and they're kind of talking, there seems to be this real tension between them.
You're assuming this is going to play out the way you want it.
I assume nothing. I anticipate the possibilities and I let the game play out.
Then why do you need Amanda in the game?
Obviously, when they first meet, John is kind of forcing him into this stuff unwillingly. But then in Paul's game, Hoffman seems to be a willing participant. He's even warning John about another detective. So my question was always, from there, where did it go so wrong with Hoffman? Where he went from feeling remorseful about abducting somebody and placing them in one of these traps to clearly enjoying it and wanting people to die in these games. I talked last time about how Saw 4 ended in a way where it very much insinuated that Hoffman was not merely another accomplice. There seemed to have been some sort of conflict between him and John, given that John is telling him, you may feel like you now have control, but you're not going to walk away untested, and I am still among you. Saw 5 doesn't really go any deeper into that. It first addresses how Hoffman was supposed to escape suspicion after the events of Saw 3 and 4. And of course shows us how John and Hoffman first met and began working together. And because of that, it saves the reveals of exactly how malicious Hoffman is for Saw 6. But what doesn't get addressed in Saw 6, and then obviously not in Saw the Final Chapter, is where exactly the relationship between John and Hoffman went so wrong. It seems to me that John is sort of desperate in a way to have somebody else carry on his legacy after he dies. And so that's why he ropes Hoffman into this against his will. But clearly at a certain point, it became clear to John that Hoffman was doing this for the wrong reasons. And what I wanted to see explored in the final chapter was the full nature of their relationship as it developed. But okay, I think that's it for Saw 5, which means there's only one of these videos left, which should be out in the next couple of days. So please be on the lookout for that, and until then...
Game over. Hello there. If you'd like to be notified when more videos like this one arrive, just click the circle to subscribe. In the meantime, you can click either of the two boxes to check out other content from this channel. Or don't. The choice is yours.